Hi everyone, so I'm moving on to the next section in this book, the Concise Guide to the Documents of Vatican II. I'm just going to start that over. I think my internet cut out. Hi everyone, so I'm moving on to the next stage of this book, the Concise Guide to the Documents of Vatican II. And the section today is on Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. SACROSANCTUM CONCILIUM. I'm going to read this because I think it's important and to read it in the text that the writer intended. Liturgy was the first topic debated at Vatican II, and the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was the first document issued. The bishops decided to take up liturgy first because of all the draft documents prepared in advance for the council, the one on liturgy was in the best shape. This was due to the fact that the ideas in this document had been circulating for decades prior to the council. Despite all its newness, the Second Vatican Council did not fall out of the sky. Rather, it was the result of a renewal already at work. Liturgical renewal prior to Vatican II. The average Catholic's experience of the Mass prior to Vatican II was of a sacred ritual that was at the same time mysterious and mechanical. Prayers were in Latin, and for much of the Mass the priest had his back to the congregation. This tended to separate the laity from what was going on at the altar. Except for the angelic-looking altar boys dressed like priests, the laity did not enter the sacred space beyond the communion rail. Before the council, the faithful took part in an array of devotions outside of the liturgy, ranging from benedictions and holy hours to novenas and the rosary. But at Mass, they were largely passive, watching a ritual done for them, but not by them. And yet, during these years, a liturgical renewal was already at work. It began among European monks seeking ways to enrich their common prayer, and it gradually spread from the monasteries to parishes. It even influenced papal teaching. St. Pius X, who was in reign from 1903 to 1914, Since the separation, many Catholics felt from the Eucharist and encouraged more frequent reception of communion. To help, he lowered the age for First Communion. 30 years later, Pope Pius XII, 1939 to 1958, made the liturgy the topic of an entire encyclical called Mediator Dei, Mediator of God. In it, Pius XII confirmed the basic direction of the liturgical movement. He called all Catholics to the full, active participation in the liturgy and said that all of the faithful constitute a holy priesthood. He recognized that Christ is present not only under the appearance of bread and wine, but also is present in the priest and the people. In terms of practice, the Pope relaxed the Eucharistic fast to encourage people to take communion, and in the early 50s, he reformed the liturgical rites for the Easter Vigil and Holy Week. Alongside such official support, priests and bishops tentatively began to experiment with ways to encourage lay participation. Limited use of the vernacular emerged. Missals with English translations of the Mass were promoted in the United States, and dialogue masses, where the whole congregation responded to the prayers of the priest, became more common. These developments, a century in the making, reached their culmination in Vatican II's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. The debate at Vatican II. After the dramatic opening of the Second Vatican Council, debate on the liturgy began on Monday, October 22nd, 1962. The debate, which ran for 15 meetings, days, or general congregations, would occupy nearly half of the Council's first session. What stands out, particularly in comparison with other documents, is how little the text changed over the course of these debates. The final text of SC, we're calling it SC because I've given the full title already, remained substantially the same as the initial draft presented to the Council Assembly. This initial draft was put together by the Preparatory Liturgical Commission during the 2 years leading up to the Council. The Commission Secretary, Father Annibale Bugnini, was a strong proponent of the liturgical movement. He helped the Commission produce a document that underscored the need for reform of the liturgy and that laid out principles to guide this reform. During the 15 days of debate on the liturgy, 328 speeches were given by the Council participants. Another 297 comments were submitted in writing. The speeches range from enthusiastic endorsement to firm resistance. The topics that generated the most intense debate were 1. The use of the vernacular in the liturgy, 2. Whether priests should be allowed to celebrate Mass, 3. If the laity should be allowed to receive consecrated wine along with the bread, and 4. What the role of the bishops' conferences should be in allowing for local adaptation. Discussion on these topics revealed a split among the bishops between a majority open to reform and a minority opposed to change. At first, it was unclear how large the minority was, but a dramatic moment occurred on the 7th day of debate, October 30. On that day, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani gave a speech strongly criticizing the document. Cardinal Ottaviani was the head of the Holy Office, now the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, and the unofficial leader of those at the Council opposed to reform. He attacked the document for proposing changes that would confuse and scandalize the faithful. He asked if the Council Fathers were planning to launch a revolution. He had so many complaints about the text that his speech ran over the allotted time. When he was asked to stop, he refused, and his microphone was shut off. The resounding applause that followed was a clear sign that most bishops did not agree with the tone of his remarks. Perhaps resistance to the document was not as widespread as some of the speeches indicated. 2 weeks later, when the first vote was taken to determine if the text was generally acceptable as a basis for further revision, only 46 participants voted against it, out of 2,215 votes cast. The pace of the Council. Many bishops complained about the slow pace of the debate on the liturgy. Nearly a month had passed since the start of the Council, and they hadn't finished discussing the first document. Part of the problem was that the Council rules were ambiguous about how long debate on a particular topic should go on. As speeches became repetitive, the bishops became bored. They left their seats to smoke or get coffee. Finally, Pope John XXIII intervened. On November 6, he gave the Council presidents authority to close debate if they felt a topic had been exhausted. The Pope's announcement was made at 10 a.m., and the debate on Chapter 2 of the Liturgy draft was terminated immediately. From that point on, the Council was able to move more quickly. But by then it had already become clear to everyone that the Second Vatican Council would need to meet again. Plans were also being made to hold a second session the following fall. It was at the second session on December 4, 1963, that the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was formally approved and promulgated. So this is now the reading guide part. The first line of SC states the four goals of the Sacred Council, SACROSANCTUM CONCILIUM Vatican II. Number 1, to energize Catholics. Number 2, to update church institutions. Number 3, to encourage the unity of all Christians. And number 4, to reach out to the world. These goals were spelled out by Paul VI, who became Pope after John XXIII's death, in his opening speech at the Council's second session, September 29, 1963. They remain a wonderful summary of what Vatican II was all about. According to SC, in order to achieve these goals, the liturgy had to be reformed and promoted. Chapter 1 of SC lays out general principles for guiding this reform. Chapters 2 through 7 take up the specific areas to be addressed. Chapter 1, General Principles, SC 5 to 46. The nature of the liturgy, SC 5 to 13. Jesus Christ is the source of our lives, our salvation, and our worship. This emphasis on Jesus Christ, so strong at the start of SC, runs throughout all the documents of Vatican II. SC states that Christ's work of redemption was achieved through the paschal mystery of his death and resurrection. This redemption touches us through liturgy, particularly baptism and Eucharist. Following the earlier encyclical of Pius XII, SC recognizes that Christ is present to us in many ways. Christ is present to us in a special way under the appearance of bread and wine, but he is also present in the priest who ministers the sacraments, in the word of God that is proclaimed, and in the assembly of people who gather in Christ's name. While preaching often precedes worship, and while private prayer and devotions are important, it is the liturgy that is the source and summit of all the Church's activity. Active participation, SC 14 to 20. The full, conscious, and active participation of everyone at the liturgy is to be encouraged. In fact, this is the primary concern of liturgical renewal, the goal to be considered before everything else. This call for people to actively participate runs through SC. It is repeated over a dozen times. Principles for Reform, SC 21 to 46. SC calls for a general reform of the liturgy. The reform is to be truly comprehensive, affecting not just the Mass, but the Church's entire liturgical system. To accomplish this, the liturgical books are to be revised as soon as possible, in inverted commas. SC lays out general principles to guide this reform, stating that the liturgy is a communal celebration and the rites should reflect this. All participate in this communal celebration according to their various roles. The permission granted later in SC 57, to allow priests to concelebrate Mass, in brackets allowing more than one priest to preside over the same liturgy, close brackets, reflects this move away from seeing the Eucharist as a private affair. The overriding concern is to promote the active participation of everyone in the liturgy. For this to occur, the various prayers and rites must be easily understood by the participants. Thus, the liturgy should be marked by a noble simplicity. Scripture is very important and should be used more, particularly in preaching. In a crucial passage, SC states that while the Latin liturgy is to be preserved in the Latin rite, regional conferences of bishops can allow for the use of the vernacular in their churches. This article on the vernacular, SC 36, is a classic example of the gentle way in which the council participants introduce change. First, they acknowledged the value of the past and then opened a door to the future. Subsequent church implementation would greatly expand SC's initial opening to local languages. In brackets, nevertheless, the liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the church is directed. It is also the source from which all its power flows. SC 10. Since the church does not wish to impose a rigid uniformity, local adaptation of the liturgy is sometimes appropriate. One of the more important theological rediscoveries of SC is its vision of the local church united with its bishop around the Eucharist. CSC 26:41, also LG, that's Lumen Gentium, 23:26. The question of the relationship of the local bishop to the universal church, in brackets symbolized by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, close brackets, would come to dominate the debate on the Constitution on the Church. But this issue first came up in the debates on the liturgy. Just how much authority could local leaders exercise in adapting the liturgy? The minority position, open brackets, voiced mainly by those bishops and cardinals who worked in the Vatican, close brackets, wanted all authority to rest in Rome, with the Pope and the various Vatican officers of the Curia. The majority position, open brackets, voiced mainly by those bishops and cardinals who led various dioceses, close brackets, wanted more authority at the local level. In the end, SC affirmed the authority of local bishops' conferences to make adaptations, provided that the substantial unity, in brackets, of the liturgy is preserved. Changes that involve a, open parenthesis, more radical adaptation, close parenthesis, are to be referred to Rome. Chapter 2, the Eucharist, SC 47-58. Chapter 2 begins with a rapid review of Eucharistic theology, instituted at the Last Supper. The Eucharist is a sacrifice of Christ's body and blood, a memorial of his death and resurrection, a sacrament of love, a sign of unity, a bond of charity, and a paschal banquet. The chapter then moves to recommendations for reform. The guiding concern is to promote the active participation of all of the faithful. Therefore, the rites are to be simplified. More scripture is to be used. Homilies are recommended, and the prayer of the faithful is to be restored. 3 suggestions for reform that provoked major debates at the council are included. Number 1, the vernacular is allowed. Number 2, communion under both bread and wine is allowed. In brackets, receiving the Lord's body consecrated at that Mass is also encouraged. And number 3, concelebration by multiple priests is allowed. Finally, the chapter underlies the link between the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Chapter 3, Other Sacraments and Sacramentals. The concern for the intelligibility of the rites and the active participation of the people continues in SC's treatment of the other sacraments. Significant proposals made in Chapter 3 include the restoration of the catechumenate for adults, in brackets, a period of formation and instruction for those who choose to be baptized into the Church. The revision of the rite of confirmation so that its connection with baptism is made clearer. The recognition of the sacrament, called extreme unction, in parenthesis, is more accurately named anointing of the sick, in parenthesis, and that it is not intended only for those at the point of death, and the renewal of the funeral rites so that they express more clearly the hope of the resurrection. Certain elements from local cultures, where appropriate, can be incorporated into the Church's sacramental life, in brackets, for example, initiation and marriage rituals. Chapter 4, the Divine Office, SC 83 to 101. The Divine Office, or the Liturgy of the Hours, is the Church's public prayer, a recitation of psalms and other scriptural passages and prayers said throughout the day. At the time of Vatican II, these regular prayers were sung in many communities of vowed religious and were required of most clerics. Thus, SC keeps these groups in mind, but the text also encourages the laity to take up this ancient tradition. The specific suggestions made are meant to help everyone who prays the divine office better integrate this practice with the conditions of modern life. Chapter 5, the Liturgical Year, SC 102 to 111. Over the course of a year, the Church celebrates the whole story of Jesus, from his birth and life, to his death and resurrection, to his ascension into heaven, and the promise of his return. The reform of the liturgical calendar is meant to bring out more clearly the profoundly Christ-centered nature of the Church's seasons. Thus, while celebrating the lives of Mary and the other saints is important, these should not distract from the Church's primary focus on Jesus. In response to the movements outside the Church, an appendix was added to SC, stating that the Council was not opposed to a perpetual calendar with a fixed date for Easter, provided that all Christians agreed on it. Chapters 6 and 7, Music and Art, SC 112 to 130. The final chapters on sacred music and sacred art generally praise the role of art and the work of artists in promoting prayer and piety. The document encourages forms of music that enable active participation of the people. In art, it recommends noble beauty over sumptuous display. Church buildings should be designed with the liturgy in mind. The space should allow for the active participation of the faithful. The document today, Understanding and Mystery. Perhaps the greatest gain to come from the reform of the liturgy inspired by SC is in an increase in understanding. With prayers no longer in Latin, Catholics today can more easily understand what is going on at Mass. With many of the rituals simplified, the major symbols in the sacraments stand out more clearly. If a sacrament is both sign and cause of God's grace, it is the sign aspect that has been emphasized since Vatican II. In this renewal, both texts and rites should be ordered so as to express more clearly the holy things which they signify. SC 21. But some Catholics feel that what has been lost in all of this is a sense of mystery. For these Catholics, Sunday liturgy feels more like an informal gathering of people than solemn worship of God. Many of these Catholics have no memories of the liturgy prior to Vatican II, but they still hunger for a greater sense of the sacred in worship. They want a feeling of awe and a recognition of God's transcendence. Other Catholics respond that God is encountered precisely in other people and in the basic activities of everyday life. This is the beauty and mystery of sacraments. God comes to us in bread and wine. God works through water, words, and in the touch of human hands. For these Catholics, the reform of the liturgy helps us to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary, the sacred in the assembly. Sometimes differences between these two viewpoints erupt in conversations about music, in brackets traditional hymns or contemporary songs, or church architecture, in brackets where is the tabernacle to be placed, how are the pews to be arranged. It is far too simplistic to label these pre-Vatican II, in parenthesis, and post-Vatican II, in parenthesis, positions, for all involved are post-Vatican II people, but they are people with different understandings of how we relate to God and how God relates to us in the liturgy. Popular devotions. SC recommends the practice of devotions outside of the liturgy. At the same time, it recognizes that these expressions of piety revolve around the liturgy, which is far superior to any of them. Thus, devotions should be encouraged so that they harmonize with the liturgical seasons and with the Eucharistic liturgy itself, but for a variety of reasons, including the translation of the Mass into English, a renewed focus on the central sacramental rites, and the changing social and cultural status of American Catholics, popular devotions virtually disappeared after Vatican II. But recent years have seen a revival of devotions, both traditional European practices and those brought to U.S. Catholicism from Latin America and Asia. The challenge remains to encourage this revival in a way that fosters the active participation of all in the liturgy itself, the source and summit of all the Church's activities. Local liturgy in a universal church. One of the contested points that ultimately made its way into SC was the claim that groups of bishops, such as national or regional conferences of bishops, have a certain authority to regulate the liturgy within their territory. Following the council, bishops' conferences translated these revised rites into local languages and customs, always conditional on subsequent Vatican approval. However, in recent years, the Vatican Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments has increasingly taken issue with liturgical proposals submitted by the U.S. Bishops' Conference, with translations prepared by the International Commission for English in the Liturgy, in brackets ICEL, a joint project of 11 English-speaking bishops' conferences, including the U.S. One complaint that was too broad a use was made of inclusive language. The Vatican Congregation also disagreed with the way in which Latin texts were translated into English. ICEL allowed for a dynamic and flexible translation into readable English. The Vatican prefers a more literal word-for-word translation. In brackets, for example, the Common Mass response, Et cum spiritu tu, that's in parenthesis, was translated by ICEL as, in brackets, and also with you. The Vatican Congregation prefers, and with your spirit. Critics argue that the Vatican dismissed years of hard work by the U.S. bishops, who, after all, ought to know their own language and worship customs better than the officials in Rome, or who may or may not be native English speakers. That's in brackets, the who may or may not be English speakers part. Those who defend Rome argue that the translations were of poor quality and ambiguous. They argue that the Vatican is simply defending the traditional doctrines obscured by these translations. Beneath these debates lies the challenge of maintaining liturgical unity amidst great diversity. Social justice. Many of the early pioneers of the liturgical movement were also deeply committed to issues of poverty, peace, and civil rights. They saw the call to, in parentheses, active participation, both in the liturgy and in the world, as of a piece. The American Benedictine monk Virgil Michel, 1888 to 1938, was an outstanding example of this dual concern. Yet SC is mostly silent on this connection. And post-conciliar liturgical reform has often overlooked the practical implications of our common worship. So on page 22, there's just a piece here on the language of the Council. It says the documents debated at Vatican II and the debates themselves were all in Latin. A simultaneous translation system for the Council Hall was proposed before the first session, but it never materialized. Much of the behind-the-scenes work of the Council commissions and the informal discussion among bishops took place in modern languages, but the official speeches in the Council Hall were in Latin. This posed a real barrier for those bishops who, outside of the liturgy, hadn't used Latin since their days in seminary. And during the debate on the liturgy, the irony of this arrangement was not lost on many of the participants. They heard speeches composed in elegant classical Latin that advocated more use of the vernacular at Mass. At the same time, they had to endure some speeches delivered in sloppy, elementary level Latin that extolled the beauty and virtues of this ancient language. So there's just a note here on page 18, Bar Jonah and Bar Abbas. Off a side aisle in St. Peter's Basilica were coffee shops set up to accommodate the almost 3,000 men gathering each day for the council sessions. Nicknamed Bar Jonah, Hebrew for son of John, in parenthesis, a scriptural reference to St. Peter, and Bar Abbas, in parenthesis, they served as a place for bishops and their advisors to discuss or escape. Escape is in brackets, the debates going on in the council hall. Credit for the idea goes to Pope John. He was rumored to have said that if the bishops didn't have a place to smoke their cigarettes, they will be puffing under their mitres. So the mitres are those hats that they wear. So for reflection, it says read SC, which is in that yellow book, or you can go on the Vatican website. And it says read SC 7. Where do you fall on the spectrum of understanding and mystery? How would you describe the liturgy at your parish in terms of these categories? Give examples. Read SC 13. Describe a devotional practice that you've experienced. Do you feel that it derives from and leads to the liturgy? Why or why not? Read SC 37 to 40. How far should local adaptation extend? At what point does adaptation change the basic meaning of a sacrament? Can you think of an example of local diversity that you feel enhances the celebration of the liturgy? Read SC 10. Are there aspects of the liturgy that you feel either invite reflection on or prompt action toward social justice? So this is where this movement comes from about social justice. It comes through Christian and Catholic teachings. So that's the first part of this book on the liturgy. And I think for me it's important to remember that even the bishops, even the cardinals that were there had problems with the Latin. I mean, it's like I studied French in high school. I took French up to level 2 here. So if you come back after 20 years and say, okay, now you have to sit through this whole thing, discuss in Latin, imagine how hard it was for them. And it's the same thing as with the translations that were proposed and suggested. It's the Americans. So now that's why I'm watching to see what this new Pope is going to do. It's going to be interesting. We have to pray. But I think we're lucky in Canada. We have a lot of new priests coming up, especially in Toronto. So that's good for us. We have more vocations. And we have a lot of people volunteering in our churches and in our communities and our parishes. And the liturgy is central to us. So yes, God is with us everywhere, and God is with us in our homes, in nature, wherever we are. But that's why many Catholics were so upset when our churches were shut down during COVID, because the liturgy is central to what we do. When you go into the church and they have the procession, when I was growing up, my mother and my father had this prayer book that they brought from India. And in there it explained what the liturgy is and how when you see the priest coming up, walking up, that's commemorating the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And then we go into the offertory, and then we go into the sacrifice of Jesus on the altar. And then the ending of the Mass, the priest is walking out and we are walking out and taking that liturgy and the homily and everything with us into the world. So for me, I like receiving both the wine and the bread at Mass. And I still do some of the old things that some people don't do. We were brought up to genuflect in the church, so many people here don't do that. We didn't have the barrier that a lot of the churches have now, that barrier where people can kneel for communion or they can stand. We didn't have that barrier when I was growing up. We didn't have the raised altar. We didn't have the Blessed Sacrament off to, like in the center, and you couldn't enter there. We could go up on the altar. We didn't have the priest chairs off to one side. They were on the main altar. So I've seen a lot of changes come in through the years, and it's different now. But at the end of the day, they're going to do what they're going to do. I mean, yes, they say they have all these synods on listening, and they want the input of the people. They want to know what we think. But at the end of the day, they do what they want. It's like the companies. They do what they want. And really and truly, where are you going to go and what are you going to do? So it's good to reflect on these things. It's good to understand the documents, to understand our faith, and to understand, where we can and cannot participate, because the church changes very, very slowly. I think we were fortunate growing up in Zimbabwe. We came into the church at a time where women and girls were welcomed into different roles. We had altar boys participating. we could stand up for our rights. But I mean, even all the sexual scandals and all that, that was part of the reason I had wanted to leave the church at one point, because I couldn't believe all the news that was coming out. And then I went through my discernment with Damien Howard in Britain, and I decided to stay. But it's very painful when you go through that kind of a thing. And at the end of the day, they're human beings just like us. They're no different. And I think that we grew up putting our priests and our nuns on a pedestal, expecting them to be different from us, to say that they represent Christ. But I think Vatican II changed that, because it made us think and say, well, we all represent Christ. We all part of the priesthood, and we are all children of God. And that's why even with the popes, you see people of all traditions going to the Vatican. Even in our church in Zimbabwe, the Muslims came to pray with us, the Hindus came to pray with us. Nobody stopped them, because at the end of the day, Christ was at the center of that liturgy. So you can reflect on it, you can get the documents, you can buy the book if you want and follow along. And I've never read like this. This is the first time I'm doing it, so I'm self-correcting as I go along. But I enjoyed taking my courses with Meg Levin at Regis, and it was a very creative time for me, a joyful time for me, very different from working in the call center. I enjoyed working at Regis College. I enjoyed being part of the academic environment, but it's very hard to get in there. So, I'm still looking for work, and let's see where it goes. But I think it's important to remember, because the Americans can be very, very conservative. People think that, the Americans are brought in rock and roll and all that, but there was a lot of pushback with that. They can be very, very conservative. And I think that's why you're seeing cardinals like Cardinal Sarah coming in, and it will be interesting to see who else comes in. But for me, I enjoyed my freedom at Regis. I enjoyed learning about the documents and the freedom of my faith that the Jesuits gave me, because there's too much red tape sometimes, and it's too much about don't do this and do that, and no, look how you dressed. And I didn't have that in Africa. I mean, we always dressed up, but I enjoyed that time at the college specifically because of that, because it's the one place where I could be myself, and I miss it. I still miss it. So that's for today. I'm going to leave it with that chapter, and those are the reflection questions. And you can go away and form a small group and reflect on them, do them with friends. We don't do it with family, because with family there's always conflict. And people take it personally. It's always, well, you think that way and I don't think that way. And so as spiritual directors, we're encouraged not to do this with family, because people, especially if you haven't been together for a long time, or people are stuck in their own mindsets, they're not going to be open to working with you as their religious guide or give you that respect. And Jesus went through that as well. So we encourage people to do it with priests or spiritual directors or whoever outside of the family, because inevitably you don't think like them. They want you to think like them, and you don't. So it's better not to do it with family. You can pray together with the family, go to church with them, but we don't do this kind of deep work with immediate family, because it leads to conflict that is not necessary. So that's it for today. Thank you.